personalities, and therefore personality disorders, are not discrete. It's a continuous spectrum. In fiction, you have the heroes, the villains at the other extreme, and then those in between. Perhaps when these people exist in real life, they could also be conceptualized as anti-heroes. Not because you'd root for them, or like them, or agree with them, but because they occupy this space of moral flexibility and ambiguity. They're a complex mix of often compelling justifications, yet very worrying overall patterns. I want to explore these types of people more because, in some sense, they are personalities in themselves, and trying to analyze them encounters the exact same problem that personality types in general have. They are useful as broad categorizations, but also get very complicated when you try to narrow down and become more granular. Conditions like narcissism or NPD are in fashion at the moment, so to speak. Yet at the same time, there are people who advocate removing those terms from the DSM. So there are very divergent views on this, and that's not surprising. Some people see these classifications as useful tools that capture the essence of and explain people who display certain sets of traits. In this case, traits that are quite dangerous. Other people see these as existing within the normal variance of human personality and might not be something that warrants or benefits from being labelled. In fact, these labels might be a net harm because people use them as excuses, mislabel people, and some people will see them as kind of appealing in a sort of edgy way to play up their negative traits to seem more interesting. So there are lots of potentially perverse incentives and outcomes from having these labels. I'm personally of the opinion that these categorizations are useful. Despite the continuous and unbelievably variable nature of human personality, they can still nonetheless be grouped, depending on whether a person displays certain traits that often go together. After all, we do this already when we describe people normally. If you were to describe someone as funny, what does that actually mean? It means that they say things that make people laugh frequently enough to the point where it is a salient trait of theirs. It's hardly scientific because it doesn't need to be. If you see someone displaying the trait or behavior, then you just say what you see. So there are some concepts, which to be honest are not very well thought out, that I wanted to get people's opinions on. So if you are a regular viewer or someone who stumbled across this video, feel free to write some essays down below in the comments. Although I might not respond to them, I will read them all because I'd love to get more information just to satisfy my own curiosity and to also inform my understanding, which will hopefully translate into interesting videos. Let me ask you a question. What would you do or be willing to do if you knew you could get away with it? You can also answer that question down below if you want, if you're in an honest mood. It's a tantalizing and often pondered question. Let's put up two ends of the spectrum here. On the one side, you have someone who would feel extremely guilty about doing something morally reprehensible. On the other side, you have zero guilt or remorse for the act. In between those two extremes, there are some interesting characters. In this case, I want to talk about the person who feels no guilt or remorse for the act itself, yet feels immense shame and guilt and remorse if they're caught. Maybe such a person doesn't exist, and it's always faked or feigned guilt when they're caught. But I think they do exist, and I find them intriguing. Let's say you break wind in public, and no, there's no need to write about that down below in the comments. You are probably going to feel lots of different emotions, chief among them being embarrassment and maybe even shame. But if you did the same thing in the comfort and privacy of your own home, you wouldn't feel that way. The feelings are context dependent, which in turn might be culture dependent, although I don't know if there's any culture that promotes breaking wind. You can take that trivial example and push it to an extreme. I think that there are people who could murder someone in cold blood without guilt that would feel intense shame and guilt if they were caught, and that fact became widely known. I believe that subset of people would fall on the narcissistic spectrum somewhere, and who knows how common this variant or subtype is. If people like this actually do exist, then they would have a form of externalized morality. When your sense of self or self-worth is externalized to that degree, I think your moral compass can be equally externalized. It's a weird notion, but I think it's possible. It's like instead of having an internal conscience or voice in your head, it's outsourced to external voices. We all kind of experience this to a degree where we've done something wrong, but because we got away with it, it doesn't feel bad, or it doesn't feel as bad. Obviously, I'm being hypothetical here, but you could keep pushing that further and further to the extremes I just mentioned. And I do think it's possible. Potentially very rare, but possible. It's like in order for that part of a person's brain, which we very very vaguely call conscience to be triggered, it needs to be associated with their image being tarnished, or it needs to come from the judgment of other people rather than their judgment of themselves. Would they feel the same kind of guilt? Who knows? This is a slightly unrelated concept, but it is partially linked, and it's been something that's been floating around in my mind for a while. I'm going to call them meta feelings. In this case, meta guilt. It's a guiltiness about the absence of guilt you might feel. It's this concern, or even just this sense of weirdness about what's missing, what ought to be there but isn't, what other people would inevitably look at as an aberration, or even as unhuman in some sense. Again, maybe that's just completely paradoxical, but you could think of it like getting anxiety about the prospect of being anxious in a situation. It's a secondary feeling as opposed to being on a specific event that happened. It's like being at the funeral of a loved one and being uneasy about the fact that you don't feel particularly sad. People with certain personality conditions, I've often heard report this kind of strange feeling, like something is wrong with them, something is missing. So perhaps that is linked to what I mentioned before. If any of that made sense, please let me know down below in the comments your thoughts on it. Also, please subscribe to avoid guilt or meta guilt.